just want to do God's will.
What you're seeking is a blessing from God.
You must expect a miracle.
You have the power of choice.
Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ.
Welcome to Life Today Live. I'm Randy Robinson. Good to have you here. And my guest and I were laughing because we're talking about spiritual warfare today. And wouldn't you know it? I mean, it's like my laptop brand name will go unmentioned, but it's like it's got demons in it today. I swear, it's like everything's going wrong technically, but we're a little bit late, but we're glad to be here. And you know, it's I don't know. It's funny sometimes. I don't want to attribute too much to things that just happened, but sometimes it just feels like, man, you know, I've been in churches where, I mean, there's a powerful moment and the power goes out, you know, and it's like, what is going on here? But anyway, glad to have you guys here. If you guys are watching, Judy, great to have you today. Hope you're feeling well. Chat is open, so you're invited to be a part of this conversation. This is core to what I do here. I always talk about growing those deeper roots that produce those better fruits, because the roots really are where it happens in our lives. The fruits will come naturally if you just grow those roots nice and deep. And a big part of that is understanding what's going on spiritually out there. You know, we're more than just a physical world. And yesterday was an interesting conversation talking to a scientist and understanding that science limits itself to the natural. Well, God is the supernatural. And so there's more out there. There's more going on. So we're going to talk about that today. My guest is Beth Guckenberger, and she is a very interesting history and ministry around the world and the things that she's doing. I'll let her talk a bit about that. But she's got a book called Throw the First Punch. And that goes right to this idea of a fight that we are in. So who are we fighting? How do we fight? How do we win? All good questions. Beth, great to have you on Life Today Live.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm just encouraged that we're having these kinds of conversations inside of God's family. I think when I was doing the research for this book, I realized that about a quarter of everything Jesus talked about was the world that we can't see with our eyes. And yet that does not consume a quarter of the kind of conversations I'm having with my Christian brothers and sisters. So I just appreciate you making space for the conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been around long enough to know that this is a battle we're in, and when we need to fight, we need to know how to fight it and how to fight it properly. I've seen kind of both sides, the demon behind every bush, crowd, and the let's not talk about that crowd, So I think we need to find that balance. So I think most of our audience will know, but just for clarity, let's talk about what kind of fight are we in? Who are we fighting here?
It's a great question. I think you're right. I think this conversation has kind of been relegated to those two extremes. Like there is no anybody interfering or interrupting. Our life and our choices are just what we make of them, and the consequences are what we feel. And then other folks who are kind of on the other side of that spectrum that says, any hard, bad complication in our life as a result of demonic activity and intervention. And I think I was just striving to have something more plain spoken, more that was like, well, let me just share as plainly as I can the things that I feel like our Bible's teaching us about this. What does it look like for there to be a battle going on? There's some new Barna research that says the vast majority of our American church doesn't even believe or isn't even sure that we do have demonic forces working against us. And so just wanting to not only expose him, but then right size him. I think sometimes when we see like art, of a spiritual warfare nature, it looks like an angel and demon are about the same size and they're engaged in a battle, and you can't tell from the image who's going to win. But these are not rivals of the same size. So just right sizing him, trying to understand what is his power, where does it come from, how does it interfere with my marriage and my parenting and my daily life. So those are the kinds of things that I was trying to unpack and really do it in a way that would be as engaging as possible.
Well, and I very much appreciate that. What power does Satan have? I mean, Satan not being omnipresent, it's kind of funny how you probably got 1,000 people around the world going, Satan's here, fight against, it's like, that's not possible actually. But As far as the demonic forces and things like that, what is their power?
It's a great question. 1 John 3 talks about the reason the Son of Man appeared was to destroy the devil's work. So right off the bat, we're like, okay, well, he's working. What kind of work is he doing? I mean, the simplest way to say it is he wants to hurt God's kids, because hurting God's kids hurts God, which is his chief desire, is to hurt God. And so when he's trying to hurt God's kids, like I in the beginning of 2020, I've been a missionary for over 25 years in countries around the world, but I was home and COVID hit the US, and I had been speaking for a couple times a year over the last decade at a large church in my hometown. And they lost their pastor right before, like literally the week before everybody went online for COVID. Wow. So the elders called me and said, we need a familiar face to do the online services. Would you consider coming and being the interim pastor at this church? And I'd never been a pastor before. I thought that sounded crazy to me. And I ended up doing that role for 8 months. But in the very beginning of that assignment, I went into a meeting, about 85 staff at the time. I went into a meeting with an agenda, because that's what leaders do. And I was like, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes into that meeting. And I felt like I was banging my head against the wall. Like just nothing was happening the way I had imagined it would or should. And so I finally pushed my paper away and I said to the staff, you know what? I'm not the only one with an agenda here. We have an enemy, and his desire is to hurt God's kids and disrupt the work that's happening inside of his house. So let's just use our imaginations for a minute. And like, if we could read the agenda the enemy has for today, what kinds of things does he want to have happen? And one brave woman went first, and she raised her hand and she said, I think he'd want us not to trust you. So on this whiteboard behind me, I wrote distrust. And then some guy said, I think he'd want us to be so afraid that we were self-centered. So up there on the board, I wrote fear and selfishness. And eventually we populated that board with the kinds of activities that we know the enemy is behind. And I finally said to them, I've read my Bible a whole bunch, and I know in Ephesians 6, it says that we're to put on our armor of God. And 1 Peter 3 says that we have this lion and he's roaring around and he's trying to destroy us. But the problem is when I sew those two teachings together, it makes me feel like I'm supposed to put my armor on and wait for the lion to come get me. And that makes me feel like I'm on defense. If he just does the same thing over and over again, every trick he has, we've already seen. There's nothing new out there. And I can imagine what he wants to do here. Instead of waiting for him to come get me, why don't we go throw the first punch? Like, why don't we not, instead of batting down the hatches and trying to keep him out of our churches or out of our households or out of our families, like, let's just go take ground back. I'm pretty sure the Bible talks about storming his gates, him not storming ours. Yeah. And there was like something that happened in that church and among that team and frankly, in my own life, when I started to realize, I read this verse, and I always say I have a Bible crush on Moses. I love the book of Exodus. And in the middle of those plagues, well, Pharaoh says to his magicians in Exodus 8, like, could y'all come up with a plague as cool as their plagues so we can show our people that our gods are as powerful as the God of Moses? And those magicians come back and say to Pharaoh, all of our power combined doesn't compare to the power that's found in the finger of their God.
A finger.
And when I think about, okay, if God has more power in his finger than what the world can put on display, and he puts that power inside of me, then what actually can I do in this battle besides just watch it, wage around me? What might it look like for me to storm into it and be aggressive in the midst of it? And that was kind of the impetus to the start of the manuscript. Just putting myself in a posture of offense and not defense.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly where we're supposed to be. We talk about the gates of hell not prevailing. Gates are not offensive weapons. They're purely defensive. The only way gates work is if someone doesn't knock them down. And so what I hear you saying is we got to go knock these things down, like the things you wrote on the whiteboard. Let's knock the distrust down. Let's knock the fear down. Knock the self-centeredness down. It's a total sidebar, and I apologize. It's just I'm curious. Obviously not a complementarian church. What church would allow a woman to pastor for 8 months?
Vineyard. It was a Vineyard church.
A Vineyard Church. Okay. I'm joining a church this weekend that would do the same thing, actually, and I know a lot of people don't like it, but that's not the topic for today.
We can make that a topic another day if you want to. I learned a lot. I learned a lot in that season. At the end of those 8 months, I told the elders, hey, I've been a missionary in countries where I had to learn the language, and I was surrounded by all kinds of physical threats. And that's a piece of cake compared to being a pastor in the suburbs of America. So be kind to your pastors, listeners, because that was a brutal job.
Oh, yeah, that is a whole other topic and an interesting one. There's a lot of weight on that, speaking sort of on God's behalf every day into people's lives. That's not a lightweight thing. Anyway, so when we're talking about these spiritual things, do you think that the enemy and his forces have any power other than to lie?
Yeah. Oh, I think there's a lot of verses that would give credence to the fact that he does have power to do more than lie. Certainly it tells us that he's a liar. It's his native language. I think, a bunch of years ago, I did a Bible study by a ministry that was called at the time World Harvest. They've rebranded and are called Surge. I have nothing to do with that ministry, but they produced a Bible study. And I had been doing at that point Bible studies for 25 years. And this one was remarkable. And I eventually called the author of the Bible study, who was the founder of that ministry, and said, like, tell me the story of how you did it. And she said, well, we were sending missionaries out to the field, and we were recognizing that if they didn't know their own Achilles heel, the devil was going to find it for them and bite. And I wanted them to recognize what that was. And so, the Bible talks a lot about how we can partner with God in order to accomplish his will, that he wants to co-labor with us, that we're co-heirs with him, that he doesn't have to use us, but he chooses to use us to bring light to darkness and all the things the Bible tells us. I think actually it works the same way with evil, that we can essentially hand the enemy all kinds of ammunition because of our own weaknesses. Genesis 4, sin is crouching at our door. Two choices, master it or a little master us. I have my own weaknesses that have nothing to do with the devil. They can have to do with my own personality and family of origin and various experiences and appetites and temptations. But when I don't do things like confess my sin, like I was just telling my teenage son last night, if you lie and you choose not to confess that sin, then you're basically giving permission to the enemy to create a little foothold inside of you and your character. And that foothold without intervention can grow into a stronghold. And that stronghold without intervention will suddenly become a part of your identity. And instead of you having lied sometime, you are now a liar. And I think the enemy wants to partner with our own natural weaknesses and exploit them in order to advance his agenda and his kingdom. That's why eventually in front of that church staff, I said, hey, why don't we work with each other against his agenda instead of against each other inadvertently for his agenda? And I've traveled lots to Israel. And one time I was there, I was standing in the ruins of a gladiator arena. And the guide was telling us a little bit about gladiator games, which I didn't know anything about gladiator games. Everything I knew, Russell Crowe taught me in that movie. But in the gladiator games, they function kind of like track meets where you have various events throughout the day. And one of the most popular events was they would chain two warriors together and release an animal against them. And if the warriors could work together, they almost always defeated the animal. But if they played against each other, if they didn't trust each other, if they played to the crowd, whatever, then the animal won almost every time. And Paul knew that. In fact, he used some of that language later in a couple of his letters when he talked about us being chained together. So I think as Christians, one of the things that the enemy likes to do is divide us, because without community, without accountability, without that natural edifying and encouraging that happens within God's family, then we're out there floundering, battling the enemy against our own sin natures and not always winning.
Yeah. And you can see that. I mean, I think we can see it in our own lives at some point, and certainly in people who are not engaged in the fight, whether they're out of just they don't know or they just don't refuse to do it. You used a word that I want to circle back to because it's a biblical word and it's a very picturesque word, and that's the word stronghold. unpack that a little bit so people know what that looks like and how significant that can be.
Yeah. In fact, modern day Christianity uses it different than ancient Israel used to use it. Oftentimes when we read about stronghold, like for example, in the Psalms, it's a very positive word. It's a word meaning a place of refuge, a place where you can go and feel protected. So I don't want to confuse any listener. There are times when biblically the word stronghold is it's a really beautiful image of a place we can go and find protection. But kind of in modern day Christendom, we typically use the word to say a place where, in fact, in the book of Hosea, it talks about we can have fallow ground in our heart, that we should break up our fallow ground. And fallow is like ground that's untilled, laid dormant, unused. That's really what we mean when we talk about strongholds today. They're like places in our lives that are fallow. We've decided, God, you can have everything, but not this part. I'm not giving you this. I'm not going there, to that relationship or to that bad habit or to that part of my history. Like we're just gonna pretend like that's not there. And that's any place where we allow darkness to linger. That's the enemy's. That's the most fertile ground he's got. That's where he knows he can go and be uncontested in some ways.
Yeah, and uncontested, I think, is the key word. And well, I want to put this in balance. So we'll talk about sort of the other side of it, but it's the uncontested where we get in trouble, because it has to be contested. And I don't know, all the reasons God has chosen to put us in a fight that He's already won, in a sense, right?
Absolutely.
Which is great comfort in knowing the end of the outcome of the game. But there is still the struggle, and if we don't contest it, we lose. And so this is what we're talking about. This is Beth's book, Throw the First Punch, and we're just saying, let's be offensive in the way we fight. And God knows if you got loved ones, children, you want to fight for them. You fight for those you love. And I also want to show you her website. She's got punchfirstbook.com, but this is right here is recklessfaith.com, the home of Back to Back Ministries, which Beth and her husband founded. So let's kind of flip the script here for a second. We've talked about the enemy, what the enemy does, some of the tactics. What's the other side of it? Because we know, like you said, the finger of God has way more power. And so this is an interesting topic, because you really have to hit it from a balanced standpoint, because you can create fear in people. And a timid spirit is not of God, which means one that's afraid to fight. And it doesn't matter what we say about Satan or demons. To me, my mental image, and this is just me, my mental image is cockroaches, because I hate cockroaches. And, if you leave the lights off, they're going to scurry, and they're going to bring nasty things and disease, and they're just awful. But I don't fear them. And I can kill them easily if I can catch them, right? But that's just my mental image. But so put us on the other side of this. What do we need to know in fighting this fight with God on our side?
Yeah, I think probably most we need to understand our identity and who we are in Christ. My husband and I have 11 children. We've adopted a bunch of them. And we adopted a 12-year-old boy a couple of years ago. And he came on with us in June full time, had lived only in a foreign country and an orphanage until then. So never really had a family like ours. It was the first real month of school. So he'd been in the US and in our household for just a couple of months. I got this text from a number I didn't recognize. It was clearly some kid who said, Tyler forgot his soccer shoes. Can you bring them up to school? So I left work and went home and found his shoes by the door. And then I drove those shoes up to an athletic study hall where he was waiting for a game to start. And when I walked in and handed him his shoes, he's like, it worked. And I said, what do you mean it worked? He's like, I told my team I couldn't play in the soccer game tonight because I didn't have my shoes. And they were like, don't you have a mom? And he's like, yeah. And they're like, well, she'll bring them. Just tell her she'll bring them. And he's like, I didn't know that's how that worked. And I'm like, yeah, we bring lunches, homework, like all kinds of things. Like he had all the privileges and rights as my son, but he actually didn't even understand how all those privileges and rights worked. And he was a quick learner. He definitely understood now after that what happens when he forgot things. But I think in the same ways, we walk around as children of God and we don't even understand all the privileges that come with it and all the ways in which God, it works. Like if we ask God and in a moment, he's waiting. He loves to respond to the cries of his kids. That's part of that child-parent relationship. And he's given us a bunch of tools. I mean, certainly he demonstrated when he was tempted by the enemy in the wilderness how to use scripture to diffuse lies and tell the truth. He certainly showed us and modeled for us what it looked like to pray. Lots of examples in the Old Testament of out before a battle would go a worship band, how he inhabits the praises of his people. He definitely demonstrates through the Gospels about what happens when we fast. I mean, there's a lot of tools he's put in our tool belt. And I think we have to get practice at them. I think we have to understand the power that's behind those tools. And so, like for me, again, as practically as I can say, I think when I started talking about the enemy around with, people in my life, just wanting to understand, what do people think about him? What do people understand about him? And everyone had these images of pitchforks and horns and I'm like, I was saying, I was on a walk with my husband, and the goal of our walk was to determine where we were going to go on vacation alone. We do that on a pretty regular basis because of our large family, and it should have been a really fun walk, but the truth was we were two different people. We had different ideas about where to go and how long to be gone and how much money to spend, and in the middle of that, without a doubt, our own sin natures wanted to beat the other person and win with what we wanted. And we began to have fights. Like, there was no devil involved. That was just my own sin. But then once that disconnect happened in that covenant relationship that's supposed to put on display the nature of God and his love for the church, like when that began to break down, I basically had like a beckoning finger, like, come on, Emmy, come on right in here. You can sit in here if you'd like to. Feel free to have a heyday here in the midst of us. And we were walking for a few minutes in silence, each in our own little worlds, trying to wrestle down our sin nature and summon up the words to be peacemakers, but not having in those moments. And then all of a sudden my husband said, what do we know? Like, what does the enemy literally want to have happen right now? And in that moment, I thought to myself, I want to work with Todd against the enemy more than I want to work against Todd for the enemy. And I think that shift has really helped me even bring my own sin nature under control, and just recognizing there are moments throughout my day when God can have victory in my life. Mm-hmm. And probably the gateway to that victory is just a regular confession of my sin.
Yeah. Confess your sins one to another so that you might be healed. Healing is the goal in relationships and our own emotions. Here's sort of the tough question, I think, sometimes, because if you're at a Vineyard Church, and we have a long history with Paul Wimber here at the ministry, so we love the church, but you and I both have probably known people who every little thing that goes wrong, they blame on the devil. And half the time I'm going, no, I don't think that's the devil. I think that's just you and your sin nature, right? Right. You know what I'm talking about? How do we know the difference? And does it ultimately matter? It all needs to be submitted to God, whether it's our own nature or an outside force. I don't know. What's your experience in that area?
Yeah, that's definitely the $1 million question. I think because that tension is so nebulous and nuanced, people tend to kind of swing one way or the other. Like, it's just not real. It doesn't happen. I'm sure right now the devil's over in the middle of that war. He's definitely not over here in the middle of my lunch hour. He's not bugging me. I'm small potatoes. Right. And when we think that, we are caught unaware. We're in a battle that we have no idea we're in, and we're susceptible to attack without defense. And when we think he's in every pothole, and he's in every sharp word I say, and he's in then I let myself off the hook, and I don't do the work of sanctification. I don't confess my sin. I don't take responsibility for areas where I'm being undisciplined or I'm being just outright selfish and sinful. And so that the world that exists between those two extremes is definitely, it's a tension to be managed, but it's the conversation I definitely want us to have, because again, in Exodus chapter 10, it talks about the plague of darkness. And it says, the darkness fell so thick on the world, on the land, that they could feel it. And I think that's part of what I want people to become more cognizant of, that sometimes darkness is so thick you can feel it. And what you're feeling, we may feel shame about, we may feel responsible for, we may feel anxious about, there's all kinds of things we can feel. But if we can just understand darkness has fallen in this place, it goes on in that passage to say, everywhere that God's kids were, light was among them. Like, God's children did not experience the darkness. And if I can be like, man, it feels heavy here right now. It feels like there's a spirit of fear going on around here, whatever it is, or right now the tensions are like on triggered, they're on a hair trigger. I can just feel, and if I can say, but everywhere that God's kids are, lights among them, then I can start turning on the light. Yeah. And then your cockroaches go running and go.
Right. Thanks for going with my analogy there. I appreciate
I was circling that back for you.
But I think that's exactly it. There is darkness in this world. That's obvious to anybody with a brain. And that's why we're here as believers, to be that light. And we do it not by generating our own light, but by reflecting God's light. And I think it's a lot of the spiritual warfare is just going, okay, let's pop that cover over that lampstand and let the light shine. And there's your offensive outward action. And the good news is we're not alone in doing it. I mean, what's your bottom line for people for all believers who need to understand what spiritual warfare is, how important it is, and how, I don't want to say it's easy, but yet it's not our burden necessarily to win. It's just to fight, right?
And I think probably part of the bottom line is when I say there are no new tricks, everything evil that the devil knows how to do, he's already shown us. Like, there's no new way to organize sin, and like everything we already know. So when we begin to see, we can, like, I had a daughter who got married last year. And so my husband and I were talking about these like punch first strategies. Like, what would the enemy want to have happen at her wedding? Or he and I speak a lot on marriage. And so the other night we were getting ready to give a seminar on marriage. And I'm like, what would the enemy want to happen? Well, he certainly would want us to get in some kind of conflict today, so that tonight we think to ourselves, I got nothing to offer because I do not have this figured out. Yeah. So what do we need to do in advance, realizing that's the pothole he's going to stick in the road. My own sin nature may be like, drive straight into it. But what can I do in advance to either shore up some strength, to confess preemptively sin that I might be tempted to do, to decide if he's having a hard day, I'm going to actually take the high road right now and not take the bait, so that we can veer around that pothole and realize you didn't win today. And now tonight we're going to do the assignment that God has for us, and we're going to do it unencumbered by the kind of shenanigans he was trying to bring into our day. I mean, that's I think the bottom line is just realizing sometimes when we can't get our hands around what exactly the enemy does, we just think, it's like too big, too hard, too complicated. It's actually easier for me just to close my eyes and turn the other way. Yeah. And I think we're supposed to run into that darkness with our swords and our flashlights and get to the other side. And I've had people say, do you feel like you're waving a red flag in front of a bull? And I said, well, I'm definitely waving a red flag, but it's more like I have no desire to pick a fight. I'm just going to let him know, me and mine, we are not available. Like, you don't have any authority here because we belong to someone else in a different kind of kingdom. Yeah. And I think that kind of confidence, authority identity is really what I want, God's kids around the world to understand.
Yeah, and that's good, because a lot of people are afraid of it, and they think, oh, the bull's gonna get me if I wave that red flag. If I walk into this battle, man, now I'm picking a fight, and you got God on your side. You got nothing. I mean, you got God on your side. There, it's an easy fight when you got God on your side. It's what I'm saying, but it's still a fight.
And God is sovereign. And I certainly wouldn't want any listener to think that I think then every circumstance unfolds exactly to your desire.
No.
There's still wars in the world being waged. There's still disease that's running rampant in our countries and in our bodies. And I don't think that this is definitely not a message with, if you pull these levers, then you're going to walk on golden streets before we're actually in heaven. That's not happening. But you're participating to the full extent that you have been called to in a war that you trust God with the results in.
And here's the thing: we're waging one in God's economy, not man's economy. For example, one of my favorite stories is the guy that was paralyzed, or the sick guy that they lowered through the roof to get to Jesus. And what does Jesus do? He says, your sins are forgiven. And everybody's like, wait, what? And he goes, what? Is it easier just to heal a guy? Fine, get up and walk, demonstrating his power. But in our economy, healing is the ultimate. Healing of the body is the ultimate, because it staves off death for a little while. It's temporary, but it's still held up high. In God's economy, forgiveness of sins is higher, because that's eternal.
Amen.
And so what someone says, why I prayed for my sister and she died of cancer, and that's true with me. But her sins were forgiven. So in God's economy, that's the victory, because it's eternal life. And in ours, if we start thinking in our terms, we think, she died at 40, which was not long enough for us, admittedly so. But that's where we got to get our eyes onto God's way of seeing things, not our way of seeing things. And in his mind, he's like, precious in my sight are the death of the saints. She's with me and eternally with me, and you will be too. So it's realigning. I really think to approach the spiritual warfare properly, we have to put on a spiritual mentality in God's way of thinking. And to do that, it's maturity, it's getting in his word, it's prayer, it's all the things that you talk about. And I think the ultimate goal is, since the enemy is defeated, is us. In other words, God's doing that work of sanctification in us, and that's why we fight. And we fight for the souls of others. Anyway, that's my soapbox.
I like it. That's exactly right. That's the epilogue, everyone. I forgot to write it, but that's the epilogue.
Okay. That was free. All right, Beth, I appreciate it. I want to show people. I showed the wrong side. I showed the book side a second ago. This is recklessfaith.com right here. So that's what that looks like. You guys check that out. Check out what Beth's doing. Anything else you want to mention? Any resources or anything you've got out there for people, or that you're doing that I failed to mention? I just want to give you the opportunity.
I mean, if anyone's interested in international missions and work with orphans and vulnerable children, that's the work we do at Back to Back Ministries. They can look that up at backtoback.org. Other than that, we're just in the conversation as best we can be.
Love it. Is that a back to back with a 2 in the middle? Back and the number 2?
Exactly right. Back the number 2.
All right.
Back.org. Yep.
All right. I love it. Beth, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and your insight and your very level-headed way of approaching a topic that gets weird real quick.
It gets weird real quick, yes. Well, thanks for sticking in it with me, Randy.
Oh, I love it, love it. And I appreciate you guys hanging out, hitting share, hitting subscribe, hitting follow. What is there? Like, something else. Anything you need to do wherever you're watching. And come back next week. We've got more great interviews for you right here on Life Today Live. We'll see you again next time.
But enjoy it. Squeeze all the fun you can out of it. This is your hour. This is your hour. Because it's soon going to end. And truth will be on the throne for a change. Sunday is coming.